have advised Boris Johnson to form a global alliance in response to the China-Hong Kong crisis. It comes after China passed a controversial security law, which critics fear will bring an end to the one country, two systems arrangements in Hong Kong. And the city-state has also banned its annual Tiananmen Square vigil over fears of large crowds gathering during the pandemic. Well, we're joined now by the former British diplomat and senior consulting fellow at Chatham House, Dr. Tim Summers. Dr. Summers, welcome to you. Why do you think these 7 former British foreign secretaries have acted in the way they have?
Well, they seem to be concerned, as you say, about the passage of the national security, the decision that the national security law will be passed probably later in June by the National People's Congress Standing Committee. The concerns really are twofold. Firstly, that this undermines Hong Kong's autonomy because the law will be drafted in Beijing and then enacted by promulgation in Hong Kong. And secondly, there's a concern that this law will undermine the rights of people in Hong Kong, particularly in political areas. What we've seen so far is the decision to authorise this. We haven't yet seen the actual draft legislation. I expect that would probably follow the sort of template that the Macau legislation took 11 years ago when they passed similar legislation. So it would outlaw crimes like subversion, sedition, secession, also some political links with foreign organisations.
We've discussed before on this subject the idea of subversion. I mean, it's such a broad definition, isn't it? If somebody decided they would make mischief with that, they could clamp down on what otherwise would be legitimate political dissent.
Yeah, well, subversion is not a very well-defined crime, and we have to wait and see when this law definitely will be, but we're expecting that any arrests made under this law will be done in Hong Kong, that the Hong Kong courts will hear those cases, they'll be open, they'll be transparent, and that people will have a chance to argue and to defend themselves. I wouldn't have thought that subversion is going to be applied hugely widely across Hong Kong to normal political dissent. I think that would be very unlikely. I think what we have to bear in mind is what's prompted this move by Beijing is two things. Firstly, the situation in Hong Kong over the last year and the continued unrest on the streets and the calls against the Communist Party, the calls for Hong Kong independence and so on. But I think it's also been prompted by the deterioration in the US-China relationship that has accelerated over the last year, and the fear in Beijing that the US is using Hong Kong as a sort of pawn in its struggle against China.
Tim, I just wonder what you make of whether the British government might be willing to follow through on this offer of a change in the status of Hong Kong Chinese. I mean, potentially up to 3 million passport holders who would have an opportunity to move to the UK. I mean, how would the Chinese are likely to respond to that from a Chinese perspective? And I mean, it comes at a potential political cost in the UK, doesn't it? You think back to the 1990s, in the build-up to 97, there was a similar move that was the subject of a major Conservative backbench rebellion.
Yeah, well, I would have thought the political cost in the UK could be fairly substantial. I mean, we're talking about up to 3 million people, possibly more, including dependents, who are eligible for this status of British national overseas. And as you say, back in the 1990s, this was on the agenda and rejected by the government at that stage. And I mean, it's quite striking the way that it's come back up the agenda over the last year. I think mainly thanks to some very heavy lobbying in London by people who would like to see this move made. I mean, what the government so far has said it will do, from what I understand, is that it will consider extending the visa length for holders of this passport from 6 months to 12 months, and that if they continue to qualify under the immigration rules over a period of time, they'd be able to apply for citizenship, rather like other people who come and live and work in the UK can apply for citizenship after they've been there for a certain period of time. So that means it's not going to be, at least on the current plan, it's not going to be a sudden move to allow large numbers of people to come to the UK. But the numbers could be very significant further down the track, and the politics will be a big part of that.
Well, on the politics, Tim, and just this idea of a global alliance, how it would work, and also whether, if some degree of sanctions were involved, whether those levers really could be pulled. I mean, for example, Australia recently said it wanted an independent review into what happened in Wuhan. Suddenly, imports of coal and food to China from Australia, which are a massive proportion of what Australia, for instance, its coal production goes to China, were hit, or talk of them being hit. That had quite a chilling effect on the Australians. And even here in the UK, if you think about the foreign student fee-paying population of British universities, stories, for instance, one university recently where there was a motion designed to criticise the Chinese that was watered down because Chinese students voted against it. Here in the UK, the levers might not be so easy to pull.
Yeah, well, I think, at the moment, given everything that's going on in the global economy, crisis in the US, recovery from COVID still some way off. I mean, sanctions against the second largest economy, and one that looks like it's going to grow fairly rapidly, would be quite a brave move, I would have thought, by some of these governments. I think that the challenge for what the 7 former foreign secretaries have proposed is to work out what the clear and attainable goals of this move would be. I mean, it's one thing to set up an international contact group to, I think they say, to monitor the situation and agree on joint action. But what sort of joint action is that going to be? And what sort of things are a large number of countries going to be able to agree on vis-a-vis China? We've seen with Trump, with the US, announcing on Friday that it would take steps against China in response to this national security legislation. Not very clear what those steps are going to be, and it's not very clear how those steps are going to change Beijing's mind. And I think when it comes to the national security legislation, the die is cast. This is going to go through. It's not going to be changed. Probably better for the UK and others to take a step back and think long-term and strategically about what options they have and what interests they have in Hong Kong, rather than rushing into something, very confrontational at a time of crisis.
Dr. Summers, appreciate your time. Thanks very much. This is Sky News Today. Coming up, back to the books. There's a division already over whether it's too soon